Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And on this podcast, I talk with friends who love Jesus, and we together try to make sense of this world. And a very good friend of mine who helps me and many people make sense of the world is Andy Crouch. Andy has written a number of books on different aspects of the world, and lately he's been focusing on technology. He's the author of the very well-regarded book, Technologized Family, which helps families make sense of the world of technology. And his latest book is trying to help everyone make sense of technology and its impact, not just on the world, but on our relationships and on us. And the book is called The Life We're Looking For. It's a great book. I think it's Andy's, like for you Andy Crouch fans out there, I think it's Andy's best book yet. They're all good, but this one I really recommend. And it's actually very relevant to our topic for today. So Andy, but first, welcome and great news for our listeners. Andy has agreed to come on as a somewhat regular, recurrent guest on Good Faith, and I'm so grateful. What's that?
It's going to be a thing.
It's going to be a thing. Andy Crouch is going to be a thing on Good Faith. And so the topic for today is ChatGPT. ChatGPT, it's the AI tool that's been dominating headlines for the last month or so. But Andy, before we dive into this topic, I need your help on another topic.
So here's the other topic, Curtis.
Thank you, Andy. Because you came on Good Faith a few months ago when David French was the co-host, and I shared with David this fact about our friendship that in our 20s, as single men living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we lived in economic community, trying to live out this axe notion of having all things in common. And David was really interested until I told him about the $10 rule.
The $10 rule, yes.
Right, so that any expenditure over $10, we would submit it to the community of five of us together.
Right.
And David was aghast. And he thought, and he's been talking about it ever since. Anytime your name comes up on the podcast or in private conversations, he says, Andy Crouch, you're a fellow member of the Christian commune where you lived under the boot hills of authoritarian community. And he's just like, that totally would violate my libertarian tendencies. And I feel like every time he brings it up, I do a poor job at explaining the $10 rule and why it actually had a beneficial formational impact. And so I'm actually inviting you to explain that rule and why we adopted it and why it actually was formational for us.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should put this in context. This was in the 1990s, so it would be the $20 rule now, probably.
Right, that's right. Inflation adjusted.
So first, let's allow for, let's put this in constant dollars. But yeah, so any expenditure over that amount, we brought to the community on a weekly basis. I mean, I think the reasons were, first of all, we didn't have that much money as a community. We didn't have anyone making a whole lot of money. We had some people making very little. We had one housemate who lost his job halfway through the year. And so,
that's right.
And we didn't discern as a community that it was best for him to go scramble for a new job. So we just absorbed the, effect of that on the income side. So I think part of it was just prudence. Like, we can't be just randomly spending exorbitant sums like $11. I think what was formational about it was just, one way to think about this is what makes us human is the synaptic gap. That is the gap between stimulus and response, which all of technology is doing so much to try to collapse now, to just get you to like click right away without interposing that gap of choice and decision and discernment, really. And by putting, consumer purchases into putting a gap between stimulus, I need such and such, and response, I'm going to buy it. And actually then bringing community into it. So not just the resources of my own will or discernment, but other people's. What I remember is that we never turned down a purchase.
We never. I don't remember a single time. Yeah.
So we approved every single thing. But what I also remember is that the act of thinking about bringing it to the community really made me just double check whether I actually needed it or just kind of vaguely wanted it. So I could really use this at this stage of my life where I could just click buy now on Amazon without going through that, even internal, let alone communal discernment. So I think what was formational about it was reflecting, the chance to reflect, and then also, honestly, just discovering that you need a lot less than you feel like you need when you're inside the stimulus response cycle of consumerism. So does that make sense?
That is awesome.
I mean, I don't know that it is going to justify us to David French or other skeptics, but I thought it was wonderful.
Indeed. And then also, I promise listeners, we really will get to ChatGPT, but I want to share one more story of my friendship with Andy. Andy contributed to the most joyous moment of my life. I don't know if I've ever told you this, Andy, but you have. Because the most joyous moment of my life, at least up till now, was June 18th, 1994, when Jody and I got married. And you led worship for our wedding ceremony. And it was a joyous moment for me. And it was my friends and family gathering together, me joining my life to Jody, being led by you in worship. And folks should know that Andy is a very gifted musician and worship leader. And the particular song, Be Thou My Vision, I felt like I was transported. I felt like I was catching a glimpse during that worship song of this is what it's going to be like. This is what it's going to be like in the resurrection when we are reunited with all of our friends and family, both living and deceased, and then raised. And we're going to see and be reunited Jesus and see, as Paul says, face to face. When I try to imagine what that future is like, I go back to Be Thou My Vision in St. James Episcopal Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with you leading that worship. So I don't think I've ever told you that, but thank you for participating in that moment.
That's beautiful.
All right.
That sounds
so
right.
Now,
it sounds right. Okay.
Let's get
now to more important topics.
More ChatGPT. So if you haven't been following the news, you should probably be aware that this is a topic that has been dominating headlines. ChatGPT, an AI tool made available to the public very recently and triggering countless media articles that begin with an article that describes ChatGPT and its impact on society, followed by a second paragraph that says, and that's not really written by me. That was written by ChatGPT. So we're not going to do that because Andy Crouch is here in the live flesh and blood. I'm not talking to a chatbot programmed to regurgitate Andy Crouch to me, although there's plenty of material for ChatGPT to do that, I suppose. So Andy, let's start. For those who aren't deeply familiar, explain in layman's terms, what is ChatGPT and how does it work?
Okay, sure. Well, so it was launched by this kind of interesting hybrid of a nonprofit and a for-profit company called OpenAI, launched in December to the public. And it's a new way of interacting with a kind of AI. We're going to just use that term for convention's sake. I'm not sure we want to call it intelligent in the way we might think, but let's just call it AI. That's been around for a few years, called GPT, which is in turn, I don't know if this is layman's terms, Curtis, but just to give the kind of context, GPT is kind of a particular strategy that researchers have been using to try to get machines to interact in very natural ways with the human world, really, whether it's language or images, or there's a number of different modes, but we're going to talk for the moment about language. And behind GPT is a larger category of things called large language models. And basically, a computer has spent time, we call it scraping, like going through all the text it can find in the entire corpus that's available in digitized form, which is, trillions of words, I suppose. And these large language models vacuum up, hoover up all of that language. And then they try, based on it, to predict what you would say in a given context with a given prompt. And so ChatGPT is a kind of an interface to that. That is the model. There's this whole category of models called LLMs, large language models. There's a specific strategy called GPT, which is on, they call it GPT 3.5. It's kind of on version 3.5 right now. And ChatGPT is a layer sort of on top of that, or between you, the user, and that acts like there's a great phrase that Scott Alexander used for it. He was borrowing it from someone else. I don't know who. A friendly, harmless, and honest assistant. It sort of takes on the character of a friendly, harmless, honest assistant who you can ask about anything. So you type it in just natural language as if you were texting with someone, and it responds usually with several paragraphs of more or less impressively relevant, clear, very, very good English, or you can try to do it in other languages, and it often will do pretty well in other languages too, about whatever you ask it about. And because it's ingested essentially everything that's ever been written, it knows, I'm putting that in quotes for the moment, it knows about a lot of topics. And so you can pretty much ask it about anything. Except current events, because it's training data. All this stuff that it ingested stopped in 2021. So you can't ask it about stuff that's happening right now, but you can ask it about history, you can ask it about literature, you can ask it about your taxes. It's amazing the variety of things. It will come up with a pretty good answer to in very natural, very, very quickly natural form.
So it seems like the big innovation here is the interface, because the underlying technology has been around for a while. I mean, your book actually wrote about the underlying technology,
right?
But the big newsworthy item is the release of the interface, correct?
Yeah, that is, and this is a really interesting feature of this. But so, in one sense, GPT, generative pre-programmed transformers, whatever that stands for, I didn't get it quite right. This is also fairly new. I mean, probably in the last 5 to 6 years that this technique was used to create this kind of large language model. But it was kind of hidden behind technical interfaces, and it wasn't widely available. And what ChatGPT has done is, at least for the moment, make it free. Anyone could sign up for an account, try it out. And it's also very natural. The ways that you used it before, which I've been doing for a while, require you to have some level of comfort with kind of a weird technical interface that people just weren't interested in finding out about. But gosh, when you can just type in your question and the computer talks back to you like a person, that's compelling. And so, yeah, it's the interface layer that actually made it a big story, even though all the capabilities were there for a couple of years and available to the public for, probably the last year or two.
So I want to talk about the emotions that have been triggered by ChatGPT. There's a lot of analysis, but what I sense is this underlying emotional valence to all of this coverage. And it ranges from, some are filled with wonder, but I would say the dominant emotion is anxiety. It's anxiety about its impact on jobs, on homework, just on a lot of hand wringing around ChatGPT.
I'm not sure the homework doers are feeling anxiety. I think they are feeling delight, but the assigners of homework.
That's right.
And just to be clear, ChatGPT can do your homework for you on almost any topic. It can totally pass up through like sophomore year of college. It could pass any test, like written test on any subject.
Right. So, Will, we can talk a little bit about these kind of instrumental impacts on things like homework, on whose job is at jeopardy.
Right. Sorry,
but I want to first talk about the emotions that are being triggered, because I think it's interesting and revelatory, right? So, when you've played a lot with ChatGPT, what did you feel when you were interfacing with it?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the main thing I felt, I don't know if this is everybody, is the slot machine feeling that just around the corner is something really amazing. So because you can, it's very patient, right? It'll answer as many prompts as you want to give it. And in this world, you can ask it questions, but you can also just give it prompts like, tell me about such and such. And every answer is decent, but every once in a while, because actually the way these models work is they introduce an element of randomness in the path that the model pursues to give you an answer. And that's actually how they find kind of novelty and possibility, because they avoid being what we would call totally deterministic, which is giving you the same answer over and over. They have an element that researchers would call stochastic, which is just a fancy word for random. And so that means when you ask it, you never know exactly how it's going to respond. And so it has this quality of any kind of gambling, which is ooh, that was pretty good. Like I won $2, but I might win $20. So it is high, especially early on, and with the classic tailing off of reward that we find with almost all gambling, it's kind of addictive. So the main emotion I felt was just like intoxication. Like, ooh, I want to try this. Ooh, I want to try this. Ooh, let me try that again. Ooh, let me phrase it slightly differently. And it was just this invitation. It was also delight, I would say. Like, oh, this is really fun. So for me, just lots of fun. And then, then some other emotions like frustration, because actually it gets things wrong a lot. So I said it can pass any test, and I think that is probably true, but it is also interesting how often it gets things wrong. And then also there is certainly this just classic thing we experience with so much technology, which is, I call it boring robots in my book. The thing that starts out and at the beginning you're like, oh, this is amazing, and I felt that about my go-to example usually is my Roomba, right? This robot vacuum. Like the first few times the Roomba started bouncing around my living room vacuuming, I couldn't stop watching. But that effect wears off, and eventually you're like, oh, time to run the Roomba again. And I'm at that point with ChatGPT. I spent like way too much time playing with it in late December, and we're recording this at the beginning of February, and I'm not even that interested in opening it up now, though I do every once in a while just to see what it will do with some prompt. So very quick quick tail off of the intoxication and delight, but it was all there at the beginning.
And just to be clear, can anybody have that experience? Can anybody sign up for ChatGPT and play around with it the way you did?
Yeah. It's getting tricky because it had this incredibly fast adoption curve. 1 million people signed up within a couple of weeks. And so some times of the day it's really busy and it won't let you in. But in principle, you just sign up for an account, start chatting.
So why then, Andy, is there this, what I sense is this dominant sense of hand-wringing worry? Why? What's triggering that?
So I think there's a couple things. One, there is a whole category of worry that basically involves the potential for deception. That is, I want to know I can trust you. Say you're a surgeon, and I'm contemplating letting you cut open my body. I would like to know that you know what you are doing. And there's a concern that this kind of tool is going to allow people to fake knowledge. So that's the homework problem, right? Why do we turn in homework? Basically to show that we know the material to a teacher. And GPT can fake homework really well. So if you're a teacher, you're like, gosh, I'm counting on people to kind of accurately represent themselves to me. Or let me give you another example. You're on, God forbid, Tinder or any of these dating apps, and initially they're chat-based interfaces, right? So when I start chatting, should I be a Tinder user with some person who swiped the correct direction on me, and they start, flirting with me or whatever, is that them being clever and funny and engaged with me and actually paying attention? Or do they have like 10 Tinder bots that are all chatting with 10 different matches right now, and they're not even talking to me, right? So one anxiety is, how do I know that people who are coming to me through some kind of mediated layer, whether it's handing in a homework assignment that they didn't write in my presence or chatting with me or whatever, like, how do I know that they are who they are? That's one thing. And that's not a small thing. That's going to become a really big thing, because this doesn't have to just happen through chat. It's going to there's already, you can actually listen to a podcast. Oh, I can't remember who it is, between Steve Jobs, who is of course deceased for over 10 years now, and some other person. I'm sorry, I don't remember who. I'm sure we can put it in the show notes, the link to it. And it's an AI generated, using samples of their voices, a chat between two deceased individuals about great product design or something like that. And parts of it it's not very good, but parts of it, you're like, well, that sure sounds like Steve Jobs talking about how he designs great products. So impersonation, very broadly, is kind of one thing. But the other, of course, is the feeling, gosh, this thing seems to do a lot of things people get paid to do, as well as people do them. So you might be assigning a history essay and worry about the essays that your students are turning in, but you also might be thinking, I'm a history teacher, and if this if this AI can tell people about the Battle of the Bulge just as well as I can, what is my job? So there's a lot of fear, as there is with every technology, and it's justified fear because this has happened over and over in the history of technology, that a whole category of jobs are going to go away. I think the difference, I was a few years ago, I was at this very interesting kind of scenario planning thing. I don't think I'm necessarily at liberty to say where and with whom, but it was a really interesting high level group of people gathered in Manhattan to talk about the future of technology and work. And a lot of the people there were kind of labor types. Like there was a former head of the AFL-CIO. I think I can say that without saying who it was. There were people who really thought about like protections for labor and workers. And one of the things people were thinking about a lot at that time was self-driving vehicles. The single most common job for men in the United States is truck driving, actually, or well, driving vehicles, and all the way up to big trucks. And so an obvious question was, gosh, what happens to the truck driving jobs if all the trucks are autonomous? Now, that was maybe 5 years ago that I was at this meeting, and it's amazing how much that scenario has actually receded, and we don't have self-driving trucks, at least yet. But I will tell you, the atmosphere in the room changed in a really interesting way when we started to consider the possibility that kind of what we would call sometimes white collar or knowledge jobs would be disrupted, like radiology. What if AI can read a CAT scan with
or coding,
coding, right?
Yeah.
And previously, so this is a room of room of elites, like no doubt, like Washington, DC, Amtrak, Acela corridor elites. And when it was the truck drivers' jobs being taken away, people were like, oh, stroking their chin. Oh, that is very concerning. We'll have to think about universal basic income. But when it was the radiologist, like you probably have 3 people in the room who are married to a radiologist, right?
Right.
It hits close to home. So I think part of why these GPT things are producing this new anxiety is they actually hit close to home of the kind of people who talk a lot about how anxious they are in print, right?
Right.
So
right.
Journalists,
it's like the machines are coming for us now. So
exactly. Like, I mean, to give you a very concrete example, I have a nomination for the worst job in the world. And of course it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's the poor 23-year-old, presumably employed by the Wall Street Journal, who has to write each day about what the market did. Now, anyone who knows anything about big publicly traded markets is that the reasons they move in the short run are completely stochastic, to use that word again, random, not explicable. You don't have enough information even to know what all the trading inputs were that made it open at one point and close at another. And this poor intern has to write some article for the next day's paper about what the Dow Jones did. And they have to know, because they're usually very smart, that this is a completely meaningless job and that their explanation is completely spurious. And this job can absolutely be done tomorrow by AI. Like AI can write, oh, the Dow Jones was up 35 points, attribute it to whatever things. And the truth is the AI doesn't even have to know the truth about why it moved, because nobody knows. It'll sound plausible. So that journalist ought to be wondering, like, why is a computer already not doing my job? Like, just because someone forgot to turn it on, basically.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really liked about, your analysis in the both the book and other ways is that you talk about that there are people who benefit and there are people who will suffer because of any introduction of technology. And you've talked a little bit about the fact that ChatGPT is so disruptive because it, in some sense, expands the range of people who could suffer, including the culture producing elites class that you've described. So that's really interesting. Who benefits? Who might benefit from this?
I think there will be a lot of benefits. Partly because one of the biggest problems with computers, generically speaking, with the computational layer of our society, is that it has required a certain amount of technical knowledge to get it to function. And so this kind of was at its high watermark in the early era of personal computing, when you really had to be a geek to get the thing to work. And for most people, it's very disempowering to sit down in front of a personal computer and try to make it work. And only the geeks knew how to do it. And we've had a whole series of kind of revolutions in design that have made that computational layer more accessible. So, but to give an example of what GPT appears to be very good at, and probably will get even better at, right now, if you want to like learn information about something, the thing most people do, well, if you are under 30, you go to YouTube. If you're over
Right.
30, you go to
Or
YouTube's
TikTok
parent
if you're under
company.
20.
Yeah, exactly. And you search. But if you're over 30, you go to Google, right? So Google search has been the dominant way. So my mother has some caregivers. We pay them as household employees. I need to find out where to put, a certain thing on a tax form. So right now I have to Google it. And what I get back is a kind of messy, often unclear list of results. Like, okay, that one's from the IRS. I can probably trust that. But wait, that one's labeled an ad. I don't want that. And I have to kind of sort through all these links, right? And figure out which one to click to give me the right information. Well, I had this very issue, like literally this issue. I went to ChatGPT. I said, which line on a tax form do I put ... And without having to sort through any links, it gave me a 2-paragraph answer, absolutely correct, very clear, explained why it was the way it was. And I did go verify it, because GPT, if it doesn't know the answer, it'll make it up and it'll never let you know. Like it's like the ultimate BS artist. But in this case, and in many cases, it's right. Like it gets it right, and it does it in a much more natural way. Like I ask it sort of not even necessarily well phrased or expertly phrased, because I'm not a tax expert. I'm like, help me out. I've got this thing. I need which form, and it answers with a level of expertise. So that's great, right? Because that opens up this information layer to lots of people who would even find it hard to sort through a Google search, or could be kind of misled by a Google search. The more technical the problem, the better technology is at the solution. So filling out a tax form is a highly technical problem. Technology is really good at that. Programming a computer is a highly technical thing. Most programmers, even today, you've got probably thousands of people programming with an AI bot programming alongside them. And so as they're typing code, which they have a lot of knowledge about, the bot is actually auto-completing and filling in the code, and it's making sure it's correct at every step. And we used to call this, pair programming, where most programming in these days is done in twos, because you want another person checking your work. Well, now you're going to be able to have an AI as your pair programmer. And because it's a highly constrained, highly technical domain, it's going to be really good at it. And so people who work in coding are going to get way more productive, without a doubt. And to some extent, you'll be able to say, gosh, I need a system to track, travel plans for my upcoming conference. Can you generate code that will do that? And you'll literally be able to say those words, or type in those words, and back will come, Python, that is coding language that implements what you want. It's pretty good at that already. So there are huge benefits, and the benefits, and this is always true of technology, the benefits are clearer and better the more technical your problem is. And they're more diffuse and more deceptive the more complex your problem is.
So give some examples of problems that would fall in that category that ChatGPT is going to really be bad at, and potentially even damaging at.
Yeah. Well, it's horrible at meaning. So, these models, all they do is predict what is most likely to come next in a sentence or a paragraph based on previous inputs. They have no model of the world at all that they're working from. Even just knowing what we might call facts about the world. But the fact is, we do not live in a world that just has facts. We live in a world that has meaning. And these models, they are not intelligent in that sense. They're not beings. They're not thinking creatures in any sense. They're nowhere near as aware of either the real world or the meaning of the real world as your dog. Like your dog is way more attentive, not just to the facts about the world as it actually exists, but the fact that somehow your dog senses when you're sad and has a desire to help you. And I'm not saying, dogs have their limits, but they are meaning interacting creatures. We've bred them to become that, really. These models have nothing of that. So the more that you are asking a question or need information that is not purely technical, but actually touches on questions of meaning, there's two possibilities. Either they will give you completely random, wild answers that you will half the time just realize are completely wrong, like on the face, Or they will be supervised behind the scenes. And this is how ChatGPT works. ChatGPT has actually been run through a whole lot of training with human supervisors who look at its potential answers and say, no, sorry, that's a bad answer. Don't give that answer when we release you in the public. Because there's a lot of like transparently evil stuff out there in the text that GPT has ingested, right? There's Nazism, there's racism, and unsupervised GPT. If you ask it, are white people better than Chinese people? It'll just sort of blithely give you an answer. I can't predict which one it'll give. There'll be a stochastic element. It depends on whether it ingested Chinese text or English text probably. And you and I know, first of all, bad question, probably shouldn't even phrase the question that way, certainly should answer in a very circumspect way. And GPT, the thing behind ChatGPT, it'll sally forth and give you a probably very disturbing answer. Now, ChatGPT has been supervised so that it doesn't sally forth. If you ask that question, I don't know exactly what it would say. We could try it right now, but it'll say something like, why are you asking me? I am just a bot. It's inappropriate to compare groups of people in this way. And that's because it's been supervised. But this leads to another problem. Who did that supervising? A certain kind of person, people working for a certain kind of company, Silicon Valley. And so their values are Silicon Valley values, and GPT's values, it's been shown, are quite left libertarian in exactly the way that Silicon Valley is. So when you pose it questions of politics, social science, etc., it will answer with the conventional answer that kind of your median Silicon Valley engineer would give, which, a lot of my values more or less align with those, like more than they would with a Nazi. So most of the time its answers are, reasonable. But I'm not getting the AI's answer. I'm getting the human supervisor's preferred answer. And now I'm not interacting with a computer. I'm interacting with a complex social system that I may or may not believe has the best interests of the world at heart. Does that make sense?
It does. So basically you're telling me if I entered ChatGPT, should I ask my friends for permission on whether I should spend $10 on this thing? It's going to say, no, why would you submit yourself to the authoritarian boot heel of communitarianism? Is that what you're saying, basically?
Who knows? Or it may have a kind of communitarian impulse. Oh, that sounds very productive of the common good. The problem is it has no actual knowledge of any value system. It's just guessing. And other things being equal, its answers are going to be very conventional. And this is another thing I want to emphasize. Like, if you want the conventional wisdom, GPT is going to be good. The problem is the conventional wisdom is very mediocre. So the essays it writes, it never writes A essays. It writes like B and B minus essays. Now, you can pass a course in college with a B minus essay, but it's not an A level like thinker. And I would argue actually it may never be that. But it's conventional in every sense. Like the language it uses is very middle of the road. The thoughts that it purports to express are middle of the road. And so anything that is like genuinely creative, it's going to respond to in a very conventional way. Like the idea that people should actually submit their purchases to one another. It's going to have a very banal answer to that.
And actually almost breeding conformity rather than creativity by definition, 100%. Right? Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I'll give you I've done this with a bunch of different texts. Where it really goes interestingly wrong is ancient texts. So the past is another country, right? That people did not think in the past the way they do in the present. And so I was writing an article about that needed to start with a reference to Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. And I was having trouble getting started. And one thing people are using ChatGPT for is like, just help me get started on this writing assignment. So I'm like, I typed in like the first half paragraph of an essay about Jacob as an entrepreneur. I was writing it for Praxis. We work with entrepreneurs. And then I like hit submit and let GPT, this was before ChatGPT, but it's the same thing. And it started auto-completing my article and describing how Jacob was an amazing entrepreneur and how he left his father and his brother Esau. And it had all these things. And the first, this happens in real time. It kind of streams out on your screen in green type or green highlighted type. And you're watching it like it's going fast, slow enough that you can kind of follow, but faster than any person could type. You're like, oh my gosh, it knows about Esau. And oh my gosh, like it had a lot of the facts. But then about 2 paragraphs later, it says, Jacob was seeking, I forget, I wish I had the text in front of me. It was like he was seeking a way to be his truest self, to fulfill. And it basically goes into this like most banal Campbell's hero's journey,
Right.
every bad Hollywood movie ever made. It goes to this most banal account of the biblical Jacob, and then eventually gets things quite wrong in how it just characterizes him, that any reader of the Hebrew Bible would say, no, that is not what it was like. But any person writing kind of a modern, like bottom of the shelf young adult fiction would totally write this way. So it converges on the most conventional, the least surprising, and it doesn't know what to do with
and
really
culturally specific, like you said, culturally specific to Silicon Valley, Western individualism. I mean, this is the Mulan problem that I talk about, right? The Disney version of Mulan, which is this ancient heroine of ancient Chinese culture that is unrecognizable to any ancient Chinese person. Like, who's like, she's finding her true self, leaving home and community to find, like, what is this? This is a completely Western Disneyfied version of a ancient Chinese heroine. So it seems like that's where we're going to get channeled to the more we sort of give our narratives over to ChatGPT to form for us.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
but it's so plausible. Like, well, I mean, you kind of want. So I was thinking about getting ready for this conversation. I was thinking, what I think is dangerous about this is first I thought we want to be fooled. Like, there's something intoxicating about, even if you kind of know you're being fooled, like, it's just a computer, but I want to believe it's actually talking to me. But then of course we also want to fool, and this stuff is going to be used in both directions. It's going to be used to fool other people in damaging ways for human connection and society. And we're going to use it to indulge this desire to be fooled, rather than the much trickier thing, which is, where do I go to find wisdom and to become a person who is wise? And ChatGPT is not going to help.
Well, this is what Andy, this is why I love talking with you about technology, because I feel like so much discussions of technology just stay in what I call the instrumental level. Like, what is this going to do instrumentally? What jobs is going to be threatened? What new capabilities will I get? And this reminds me of a conversation on a podcast with David a couple of podcasts ago, where we were talking about entertainment. And I think the same categories we used for entertainment applied to technology, which was, David was saying, well, the question that a listener had posed was, how do you relate to entertainment? And David's point was, well, you can't relate to it as a third rail, as it's something of which it is dangerous and we just need to protect ourselves from it. And in the same way, I don't think technology and AI, using that term, or ChatGPT, can be viewed as a third rail that's like the source of evil. We just need to protect and insulate ourselves from it. But I said, I agree with that. And I was trying to think metaphorically, because I was like, but we also can't treat it as an electric socket, as something that we can just plug into as an instrument, get what we want out of it, and be otherwise unaffected and unformed. So it's not a third rail. It's not an electric socket. And then, actually preparing for this podcast, I was thinking, well, what is it then? What would be a better metaphor to describe? So, Andy, I'm going to invite you to come into the metaphor workshop with me here.
I'm firing up ChatGPT. Give me a metaphor.
That's exactly. You're going to tell me. Well, I thought, I wonder if both entertainment and technology might be more likened to radiation, to electromagnetic radiation, in that it is actually quite pervasive all around us. Radiation actually bathes us. The sun is bathing us in radiation as we go. And it actually nurtures us. There's something that we draw from it that actually is good, life-giving. And so there is that. And there's sometimes we want to harness it in very focused, concentrated fashion to solve very specific, what you would call technical problems. Like, we need an X-ray, or we need radiation therapy for cancer. So we can harness it in very focused technical fashions. But we can also be exposed to it in just thoughtless, unknown ways that actually, like radiation, can deform us, can create mutations in our very being, so that at the level beyond just instrumentally what it's doing, it is having some intrinsic formational, potentially deforming, mutating aspect of our very beings, right? So to what extent then, and you've already started exploring this, how might AI, what do we need to watch for AI and these tools potentially deforming us and mutating us?
Mm. Hmm. It's funny. I was wrestling with your parallel there between technology and entertainment, and with the question of whether the same metaphor would actually apply to both. But actually, I think you're onto something, because in some ways it seems to me, one way to think about what it is to be human is that we are made for work and rest. So this is the biblical understanding of humanity from page 1 of the Bible. God himself is portrayed as a worker, or a maker at least, but also as a rester each night of the 6 days, and then on the Sabbath day, the 7th day. And humanity is meant to image both the work of God in God's world, using the material that God has entrusted to us, and to rest in God's world. And it strikes me that entertainment is the kind of implementation of the desire to rest. But the moment you say that, you're like, oh, but I'm not sure all the time that I'm binging Netflix I'm having Sabbath rest, right? Because actually there's a distortion of rest. I talk about the distortion of work and rest becomes toil and leisure. So the world we're meant to live in is a world of work and rest, but the world we've ended up in is a world of toil and leisure. And leisure is kind of a facsimile of rest that often, strangely, is not that restful. In other words, you don't necessarily feel better at the end or recharged at the end.
But like after a night of binge watching Netflix, how restful do people actually feel? Right?
Kind of sick, right?
Yeah.
But what were you experiencing? Why were you drawn to it? Because it is this kind of inactivity that is sort of pleasurable in some very small cycle of pleasure, but doesn't restore, doesn't entrust yourself and others to God. And you're being, I mean, very literally entertained. Like you're being sort of, someone else is taking care of creating a restful environment for you. Whereas, that's just so different from the entertainment is such a small category of things that we could do to genuinely lay down our work and kind of take up the gift of rest. And yet we sense that sometimes watching that TV show is actually restful when it's done in the right proportion at the right time with the right people. So entertainment kind of both can be rest, but also can clearly be this sort of damaging leisure that deforms us, like you said. Well, I think technology is the same thing for work. So we buy it, we deploy it because we think this will help me get stuff done in the world, or at least somebody at some level of the economy says that. And that there's some truth to that, because it really does increase the kind of leverage in a sense. I mean, going back to the mechanical forms of technology through the electrical forms, now the electronic and digital and information forms. It's a lever for human work that is good, because human work is good. And at the same time, just like entertainment, insofar as it is part of the human free gift, creative response to the free gift of the world, is restful. So technology can be workful, but it can also, like entertainment, be this sort of diversion into this, what I call superpowers, this kind of dream of effortless power, or the dream. I also talk about this in the book, The Dream of Magic, which is, wouldn't it be amazing to do work without having to work, and to get things done? And here's the even deeper thing I've been thinking about recently. I think the quest of magic in some ways is to make a difference in the world without having to become different. So if I want to play the piano, I have to become a piano player. But if I just want piano music in my house, I just load up something on Spotify and press play, right? I don't become anything different. And magic, there's piano music in my home if I have the necessary technology. And this dream of work without becoming, which, I mean, another way to put this is results without virtue. That is the idea that I don't have to develop virtue or skill. That is actually a deforming dream, a damaging.
That's right. That's mutating of what it means to be human.
That's the mutation. And the wild irony of it is, if you get what you're dreaming of, namely, like the world does seem to start working on its own, strangely, your life will not have less sensation of toil. It will have more sensation of toil. So when we used to meet in person for meetings with our work groups, if we work in an office kind of environment where you have meetings, people didn't necessarily love meetings, but you're together with other people in person. Then we went to Zoom meetings. And so now technology is making meeting effortless, right? I don't even have to get out of my pajamas, at least for the top half. And I show up on the screen, and what did we feel at the end of a day in Zoom meetings? Way worse than a day of in-person meetings. So, and you feel like, oh my gosh, that was so much toil. What do? Go to Netflix, have some leisure. So the very quest for this kind of magical world of work without virtue actually ends up feeling so strangely like toil. Like if you showed our grandparents how little actual stuff we do, they would be like, you must be so happy. Like you don't have to, wash the clothes on a washboard. You don't have to, and we'd be like, I don't know how to explain to you, but we are not happy. Like we are less happy. And it feels like we have more toil than we've ever had. And sorry, I know I'm going on and on, but there's another layer below it, which is sustaining all this magic. There are people literally toiling. So to do this ChatGPT thing, one of the big problems is people ask questions deliberately and not that are going to lead to very, very inappropriate is like the third grade teacher's word, that's inappropriate. And OpenAI knew if you let unfiltered GPT in the world, it's going to say racist things. It's going to say violent things, dehumanizing things. So you know what they did? Time magazine just reported on this in January. They hired through a contractor, beautiful kind of plausible deniability through multiple layers of contracting, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people specifically in the nation of Kenya to spend all day, every day, reading the vilest forms of text description. I mean, I'm not even going to say the art. If you want, you can go read the Time article. It describes what people had to read about to classify them so that ChatGPT, when it encountered such text, would not kind of go down that path. And one person who had worked, and they were paid $2 an hour, by the way, for this work.
You found the job that's worse than that Wall Street Journal intern.
Well, that's why it's only a joke about the Wall Street. No, it is these content moderation jobs, as they're called, that every social media network relies on, because otherwise, literally, there would be decapitations in your feed on Instagram. But somebody has to intercept it, a person. And there are people out there, and now this is real toil. This is not Zoom meeting toil. This is like dehumanizing, degrading, violating work that people are being paid to do, paid a wage that will attract someone to do it, but in parts of the world that are very vulnerable. And all that toil has to happen for us to have the magic.
That is very sobering, Andy. And that is
sobering.
Baked into technology. That is the logic of how technology works in the world. Andy, I really love how you're describing how AI will form us in these human activities of work and play. And it strikes me that it will channel us more into these two categories. There's two categories, though, that are deeply human that aren't covered by those categories. Oh. And that is worship and love.
Oh, wow.
And it just struck me. Okay, let's go back to June 18th, 1994, St. James Church. If I wanted to exercise what you called my superpowers, I could have, if I had the technology available today, pressed a button and gotten world-class versions of Be Thou My Vision, and those bits turned into music streaming through that church. And it would have been technically a better, more perfect rendition of that song than you did, even as good of a musician you did. And there would have been no one that would have had to develop the years of practice and toil that you did to hone the craft of musicmanship and worship leading, right? And that would have filled that service. And I got to tell you, that would not have been the most joyous moment in my life at all. And because there would not have been genuine worship, which involves work, involves us cultivating our abilities, our to worship, and love, which involves giving of ourselves, ourselves that are things are genuinely within us, not pretended, not pretense, but actual genuinely capacities within ourselves. And that, if we are deformed and diverted from that is a profound loss.
Wow. Yeah, because it's not just and by the way, like this, as you may know, and some listeners will know, this literally exists right now. So I forget that there's a brand name for it. But basically it's a set of electronic tracks for every commonly sung worship song. So that churches that don't have musicians who play the bass suddenly have a bass player, and it's perfect. Like it's perfect every time. Or you need a keyboard player. It has that, right? This is literally happening in churches every Sunday, using these worship tracks. And so they'll have some musicians maybe on stage, but then it's filled in with all these other tracks. And if we'd done that at your wedding, or if you had done that at your wedding, it is striking to me. It's not just that I happened to bring a certain kind of skill, right? It was the relationship.
Completely.
Because actually, if you had hired like some random, I mean, there's good piano players in Boston, who can play "Be Thou My Vision." It wouldn't be what it was.
Not even close. Yeah.
It was the relationship. It was that we lived together. It was, we are friends and brothers in Christ, and that was essential to the experience that even just a skilled hired musician wouldn't bring. But certainly the machine doesn't love you. It doesn't care that it's your wedding. It doesn't it's like, one more playing of "Be Thou My Vision," click, and it's the same every time. And that's right. And that's like the opposite of incarnation, right? And by the way, this is the other deep thing happening in technology. It's this dream of discarnation, this dream that we would be better off if we were not in bodies, if we weren't placed on this troublesome planet, if we weren't mortal. And yet the Christian witness is, no, actually, the only truly human life was lived in a place, born of a woman, grew up patiently, slowly, the way a human being does, learned one human language and spoke it his whole life. And that incarnate reality is what unlocks possibility in the world, not the discarnate kind of scale of technology.
And it is the future we are actually looking for, because the resurrection is the embodied reality that we are called to glory in and give ourselves to each other in love and in worship. And so a technology that takes us away from that is taking us away actually from our true future. It's actually retrograde technology in that regard.
Yeah, totally. And I just, what troubles me is it's an awfully good simulation. And in my own life, and even in some of the days on December when I was playing with it, I had better things to be doing, to be honest. I mean, there was I could justify some of it by I'm sure I'll be on a podcast sometime. I need to know about this. Right. But part of it was, I'd rather live in that simple, magical simulation than write an article that is hard to write, or make a phone call that's hard to make, or sit down with my wife and talk with and I think just going back to your worship example, and the reality is that in the quest to have music that sounds decent on a Sunday morning, let's say most church services are Sunday morning, we are bringing in the bots. The bots are playing for us to worship to, but they do not care about us. They cannot care. They do not know the moment that they're in. But we're getting decent. It sounds decent in a typical kind of low church evangelical environment on a Sunday morning. And we're like, that's pretty good. That was better than the guy with the guitar who was kind of out of tune. But you're missing, but everything's diminishing while you press that button. The capacity of the congregation to sing is diminishing. The capacity of that. I was just with actually I played in worship on Sunday at my church, and the young woman was playing violin. Most violinists don't know how to improvise. They don't know how to play kind of off the music, right? But she could. I said, how did that happen? She said, I was in 7th grade. I was in a youth group, and my youth leader said, hey, do you want to try playing? And she said I was terrible at it, but he let me try and encouraged me, and that group encouraged me. And she's now a very capable musician for worship in this modern vernacular. That opportunity, that grace-filled, loving group of people who are go ahead, try it, develop your skill. Now they can just press play and have amazing music, and they'll never develop that seventh grader into a now 28-year-old or whatever who can enrich a human environment with her skill.
Well, and that's the impoverishment of life when we reduce things to instrumental, like literally instrumental
Yeah.
calculations. We forget that we are beings with intrinsic meaning and worth that are
Yes.
meant to be formed, not
Yes.
just do things, not
Yes.
just
Yes. Yes.
instrumentally
Yes.
accomplish things. And the process of being formed involves work, so that
Yes.
it's back to the homework issue. Yes, of course we can generate same quality devices, but we're not being formed by that process.
Exactly.
We're not stretching ourselves and working at it and crafting and rewriting sentences and the struggle you need so that we ourselves become better thinkers, writers, and wiser.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it's because of this just cascading breakdown of love, basically. Because I love what you said about worship and love. But it actually strikes me those are not totally separate topics, because I think worship is the ultimate form of rest. And I actually think all work should be done in and for love. The reason to work in the world is love. And it is the reason everyone in the world, except people like you and me, are very, very privileged. But most people, why do they go to work? They go to work to provide for their families. They go to work because they love some people and they need to provide for them. And they work, and it's why the cab driver has the picture of his family on the little, in the little frame in front, because he's there out of love. And when love breaks down, and in that classroom where the students are tempted to just have GPT do the writing for them, so they don't have to do the formative work of writing that history essay that everybody has to write in 10th grade or whatever. Why? Because they don't actually believe there's a teacher who loves them enough to care whether they get developed. They believe their teacher is instrumental. They believe all their teacher wants is for them to kind of show a certain thing to get a certain grade. But if they truly knew they were loved by that teacher, and if that teacher in turn felt like he or she was loved by the system around him or her, instead of beaten down into just trying to grind it out and get through the day, like why I say it's a cascade. You would never think, like when I was taking piano lessons, I would never have wanted a player piano to do my practicing for me, because I had teachers who loved me. And you have to have a teacher who loves you to do something that difficult, to like achieve mastery level on a classical instrument. But without love, it turns into, we all start just gaming the system and letting the magic try to, harness the magic.
So I think I'm imagining listeners are getting a sense of technology and how it could deform us, how AI could deform us, and actually kind of shortcut the process of true human formation and true human glorification. But they're probably wondering, okay, so what do I do? What do I do now? If this technology is like radiation, is just bathing us in invisible fashion all around us, what do we do? And I want to actually make an observation that actually gets to that question, which is a question of agency. It's a question of human agency to say, wait a minute, maybe I can do something. I can choose differently. And what's been just fascinating to me in all the coverage of ChatGPT is it's all on that instrumental level, right? So it's all about how will this affect my job? How will this affect homework? What do we do about this? And no one's asking, or at least I haven't really read really in-depth analysis of, wait, should we be doing this? Like, should we? It's just assumed that, like radiation, like the sun, it will be there, and we just have to make terms with it and accommodate to it. And I guess what we're trying to encourage ourselves and encourage our listeners is, no, you're a human, you have agency. Let's not just give ourselves unthinkingly to it and let it deform us however it would. We can actually make some choices. So what would, at this stage of the game, which we know AI is still in the early innings of its sort of growth, but even at this early stage of the game, Andy, how do we start to make some choices to exercise our God-given agency to actually be formed and not let this force deform us?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we have to treat it. It is going to be an available tool for the work that human beings are called to do. It already is, and it's going to be more and more so. And we are in such early days. It's going to get both better generally, but also more optimized for particular tasks that it's going to get very, very good at. in useful ways. I'm thinking about a kind of a pyramid with a wide base and a narrow top, and it seems to me like all technology, especially our modern kind of what we generally mean when we say technology, which is like the last 100 years, is best used at in a sense, just at the tip of a pyramid that's built on deep foundations. So very intentionally for 5+ years now, it kind of started randomly, but now it's like a bedrock practice of my life. I start my day outside. I make some tea using electricity, I will admit. So I'm already enmeshed. Like the radiation is there. So I use some electromagnetic radiation to create some heat and heat up some water, brew some tea. And then I take my tea outside. I stand out in creation. Some days I do it in bare feet. And I spend not necessarily a real long time, but long enough to feel like a creature. I do this notably and intentionally before I look at a screen, because I want to start my day grounded in the fact that I'm grateful I live in a house, but in a sense, my house I need to get out of my house. I need to get out into the world and realize I am very small. God is very large. There's more to this world than my concerns. There's more beauty in this world than I can bring into my home. Like just all these different things. And then I have to go through my day kind of re-grounding myself in the work I am given to do as a heart, soul, mind, strength complex designed for love. And when I'm doing that, building the base of the pyramid on these things that are deeply human, and which I have in common, by the way, with all human beings who have ever lived, not just the handful who have access to some of these techniques that we have, then I think there is a way I can turn on the screen and make use of it as an instrument in the best sense for the work that I'm given to do with the people I'm given to be with. But if I start to use that technological stack as a substitute for the real work I'm given to do. So, I'm cutting way back on social media because social media is very, very technologized. And it just becomes clear to so many of us over time, no matter how much influence we gain on those platforms, it does substitute to some extent for conversation with real people. Like, oh, something interesting happened to me. Do I tell my wife about it or do I tell Twitter about it? Well, there's actually something really important about saving it for the conversation at the dinner table rather than just sort of broadcasting it into the world and getting however many likes back in this very thin way, right? So the more that we can build on a base of the truly human, the less concern I have about adding this layer of tech at the top. I think where this gets really challenging is the world that I get to work alongside at Praxis, where we're working with entrepreneurs who are starting businesses and nonprofits. And you're doing that in this supercharged, very competitive economic environment where the tech way is often the fastest way to low costs and therefore decent margins, right? And I think the great challenge is actually not so much how do I individually live, but how do I participate in systems that are deeply human at the base, at their root, and that only use technology when it actually advances the deeply human, rather than all the incentives are to create systems that really require human beings almost not at all. And like ideally would just be this 100% gross margin profit generating machine that didn't require any people. That would be that's the goal everybody's kind of implicitly chasing. Even though whatever that turned out to be, I think TikTok is actually something close to it from a business model point of view, because very light on employees and very, very powerful on algorithm. We know what maximizes that margin, and it's not good for people, right? Yeah. So, but how you carve out a space in this world, this economy that we're living in, where you can actually survive as a business, but not give in to the technologization, the technological substitution, that is the massive question. How do you raise a cow in a healthy way in a world full of factory farms where they're undercutting you on price every day? And is there a way to raise a healthy cow in a way that God would say, thank you for how you stewarded my bovine creation? It's a very, very small lane that you have to find that is responsible stewardship of the world. Does that make sense?
Well, that macro level question, Andy, is one that's fascinating and one you're going to have to come back. You've already promised to come back to explore further. But from our good faith listeners, I want to leave with that recommendation to build that base. Like, let's, as a community of listeners, look for ways to build that I love that phrase, that base of practices that call us back to creation and creatureliness. So yes, exactly, whether it's for you, some daily practice that Andy describes that takes us out into the concrete, real world of creation, slows us down to be small in this world, yes, and not a superhero, with superpowers. Yeah. I think that's a great first step for all of us. I think another one I want to invite all of our listeners to consider is carving out this space away from social media that does this job of mediating human relationships in this artificial way. And how can we just create more space in our lives for actual human conversation in people we live with or people we're friends with? Those seem to me like rock solid practice that anyone, all of us, can engage in. So those are great words. And Andy, with that, thank you so much for what a just delightful, stimulating conversation. I'm so looking forward to your future visits back with us.
Me too. This was amazingly fun. Thank you.
So, good faith listeners, stay tuned for next week. We'll be coming back to you again. You're getting our podcast at the same channels, whether it's Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever. Nothing is changing. We're continuing on that same way. If you wanted to post comments on individual podcasts, you can still do that at the Dispatch site for a few more weeks until the February 18th before we change homes to Redeeming Babel. But until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless.